Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar, and welcome to the first installation of the HUD Distressed Cities webinar series. Today's webinar is going to be focused on helping jurisdictions respond to local housing needs posed by the pandemic. Before we get started, we did just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. So you are all muted and will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar. In order to submit any questions or comments you have, you can use the chat and Q&A functions. Please use the chat box to submit any technical issues that you're experiencing with audio or hearing or anything like that. And please use the Q&A box to submit any questions that you have for our panelists. We will hold all of the questions until the end, and we'll do a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. But you can feel free to submit your questions at any point throughout the webinar, and we'll just hold them for that period. We'll also be doing some live polls throughout the webinar, so we just wanted to make everybody aware. So be ready to answer those. You'll see them as a little pop-up box, and you should be able to submit your answers via your computer. And then lastly, we'll be making the recording and all of the related materials available after today's webinar, so be on the lookout for those. Before we get started, I also just wanted to quickly introduce our panelists. We're going to hear from Lilian Alexander, who's a Senior Program Officer with LIST. We'll also hear from Anselmo Tellez, who's a Senior Housing Specialist with Housing Assistance Council, or HAC. And we'll also hear from Leslie Strauss, who's a Senior Policy Analyst with HAC. And finally, we'll hear from Callie Seltzer, LIST Director of Housing, who I will now hand things over to get us started.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Awesome. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Callie Seltzer. I'm the Director of Housing for LIST. I'm based in DC, and I've got colleagues here from all over the country, and we've got attendees from all over the country as well. So thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us your time. We hope we will make good use of it. We're going to move into the agenda. So today's agenda is sort of in 4 parts. We're going to start with the discussion of the impacts of COVID-19 on affordable housing and housing generally. We'll move into a discussion about available resources, in particular federal resources that your communities may be attempting to access or have already received related to COVID-19. And then we'll move into a discussion around how you can think about the immediate and also long-term needs and craft a housing strategy that's responsive. And lastly, we'll hear a couple of good examples from small cities and rural communities, and we'll also leave time at the end of this webinar for some Q&A. You are welcome to put a question in the chat box if you'd like to tee up a question for our Q&A at the end. And I'm going to move us just straight into the first part of our agenda. So I think all of you probably have felt this on some level, but the big picture is that COVID-19 really is exacerbating housing instabilities for the most vulnerable in our communities. And with that, we'd like to just pose a poll to see who's here today so that we can get a sense of how you are experiencing and also trying to adapt. So if we can put the first poll question up, Sarah.
Yep, we'll do. Sorry, I just need to transfer presenter privileges back to myself really quickly before I open it. Great.
So you guys should see the poll question. The first question is just who's here today? So are you representing a unit of government or a nonprofit or maybe a community-based organization, CHODO, CDC, et cetera, legal services or working on housing counseling issues? Please just respond in the poll, which should be in the panel on the right of your screen, and give us a sense of who's here. Thank you. We've got a 2-minute kind of time set up for this, so bear with us. And the second question you can answer simultaneously, which is about your current role professionally. How much of your total time is spent working on housing issues in your community? That could be housing generally, that could be very specific affordable housing issues, but we just want to have a sense of, how often do you engage on housing topics? Is this really new for you? So we can make sure we're calibrating the content today to your needs. Thanks. Make sure after you actually click the little circle that you hit submit, and that's how the answers actually get recorded. Okay, I think we'll give just maybe about 15 more seconds for the poll. And I'm going to just keep us moving. So as we begin, the availability of quality affordable housing has really been the biggest challenge that many of our communities were facing even prior to COVID-19. And particularly communities of color and low-income communities have been disproportionately affected by the public health crisis and its ripple effects. And these households, we know, tend to be already rent-burdened, housing unstable, living in overcrowded conditions in many cases, at risk of homelessness, a paycheck away from homelessness, and on top of that, employed in the 5 industries that have shed the most jobs in recent weeks. The data is pretty clear the way that this public health crisis is pressing down on particular segments of the population. I think we're going to close out the poll now, so if you haven't clicked submit, please do.
And it looks like we have a good number of people that were able to respond, so I'll just go ahead and run through some of those results really quickly.
Great.
So it looks like in terms of who's here on the webinar, we have a good number of folks from, let me just see if I can expand this a little bit, from a unit of state government. We also have a good number of people from a county government and from a nonprofit. The exact number is 41 folks from a unit of state government. Sorry, Kelly, it makes sense for me to run through the entire breakdown.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. I know you can't convert them to percentages in your head, so we'll just we'll bear with you.
Let me see if I can actually just expand this a little bit, and then I can read percentages. There we go. So it looks like we have 9% of folks from a unit of state government, 13% of folks from a unit of county government, 25% of the people on are from a small city government, 2% are from a town, parish, or village government. We have 7% from federal government, no legal service providers, and then 15% nonprofit or community-based organization, 3% for-profit organization, and 7% other. And then in terms of people's current role, how much time do they spend working on housing issues in their community? We have 3% of folks who said that they spend none of their time doing that, 27% who said they spent some of their time doing that, 15 who spend about half their time doing that, 18% who spend about most of their time, and 16 who spend all of their time. So a good number of people are spending a lot of time on this topic.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really helpful to understand the distribution. So thanks all for participating in that. Moving on to our next slide. Just as we think about sort of the waterfall effect or the cascading effect that this crisis is having in terms of housing, certainly starting with joblessness and that disproportionately affecting service sector and low-income renters and low-income homeowners. And as I mentioned earlier, that those households are also more likely to be employed in the industries that have shed jobs, and it remains to be seen in many of our communities which jobs will and will not come back and or experience other kind of instability in the economic sense in the coming months and years. These losses have joblessness, that is, and income losses have really been remediated by large scale unemployment benefits. So what's important to know is that those actually expire. There's, an additional $600 a week unemployment benefit that many folks are getting through CARES, and that has been paying a lot of the rent and or mortgages. The data is pretty clear about that. So that's been really great. However, that will expire, and Americans already owe a significant amount of rent. 77% of multifamily properties are reporting that rent has been paid for July. That's down a bit from last month, but it also still is reflective, we think, of that large-scale unemployment benefit. And I think someone's saying in the chat they can't hear, but just double-checking, Sarah, you can hear me? Everyone can hear me?
We can still hear you, and I just sent that person instructions for how to
Thank you.
audio.
Okay. Thank you so much for your multitasking. So eviction protection for renters that was included in CARES also expires in pretty short order here, July 24th. That 3 months went by really quickly for a lot of people. And as you probably are experiencing, the federal relief packages so far that have passed are really not sized to meet the needs that we see coming across the country in the places that you work and serve. So we wanted to kind of think about housing stability risk. So for those of you who maybe don't spend all of your time on housing issues and or working with affordable housing owners, it can be a bit of a alphabet soup. There's Section 8, there's public housing, there's LIHTC. There's a lot of different types of affordable housing. And it's really important to understand the underlying structure just enough so that you can understand the risk that a job loss at a household level actually poses to different types of renters and or homeowners. So we put this on a continuum here. You can see on the left kind of the lower risk in terms of housing stability. And I'll just briefly explain why, but Section 8 and project-based Section 8 and also tenants that live in public housing or project-based rental assistance properties, as we know them, Section 8, public housing being a different entity, but kind of all four of these on the left here, those tenants, when they experience a loss of job or income, their rent gets adjusted accordingly. So they are not, they're not in what we would consider a severe risk category for losing housing or eviction. That's in part because of who runs and operates and owns the housing they live in, but it's also because of the way that the subsidy is structured. It's actually a rental assistance subsidy that goes to the property and or the tenant and is adjusted based on income. Right in the middle there, we have the low-income housing tax credit properties. These are often operated by nonprofits or mission-oriented groups. The LIHTC financing mechanism has been really the main engine of development for the past 30-odd years. However, it's not a project-based subsidy. So tenants that live in LIHTC projects that don't have one of these categories on the left, Section 8, voucher, or something else, but are living in just plain LIHTC properties, there's a little more risk there in the sense that when your income changes, if your income changes or drops to zero, your rent doesn't, and your rent stays the same. Your landlord is needing to negotiate with your landlord to figure out what you can pay, but essentially the property level takes the hit if the tenant can't pay. So this is generally for housing and for affordable housing stakeholders, this is an area of concern because these properties operate for some of the most needy in our populations and are incredibly important to the overall ecosystem of housing in this country. And there's really no one paying the rent if the tenant can't. And certainly, the landlords are not going to be quick to evict because, as I mentioned, they're mostly mission or nonprofits in a lot of cases, and or there's regulatory structures that keep them from evicting. But this is an area to look out for in your communities. And as we move to the right on this continuum, I think we're just talking about people that don't have a direct tie to any kind of public subsidy or assistance. The majority of American homeowners and or renters are not assisted. They don't have a monthly subsidy. They live everywhere. They live in single family, they live in multifamily, they live in condos, all kinds of buildings. They pay their monthly mortgage or they pay their rent. And these are of extreme concern right now in terms of eviction because landlords are faced with, tenants or tenants that are unable to pay, and there's really nobody to foot the bill. Especially with the coming expiration of the CARES Act eviction moratorium. We're already seeing a lot of evictions filed all across the country. We've put in a few resources here for you to just understand a little bit better. As you start to think about, who in my community is most at risk right now? Is this on top of it, pre-existing risk such as the vulnerable communities that we mentioned in the beginning? You know who your vulnerable communities are in terms of income, in terms of maybe a household disability, job instability, food issues, accessibility, mobility issues. These are all compounding in addition to loss of job. Please start to think, if you can, about this last slide, just kind of going back, how does your community stack up on this continuum, and who should you be most concerned about right now? People that have maybe access to a public subsidy are of less concern in terms of their housing stability, but that doesn't mean that joblessness isn't creating all kinds of ripple effects for them in terms of food security, mobility, transportation, household level needs. So we put a few resources here. If you would like to understand better at like a very local or even county level, what's happening in terms of evictions, there is a great resource, the Eviction Lab. It's out of Princeton University, and if any of you have read Evicted, it's actually affiliated with Matt Desmond. And that's a really great book to understand evictions generally, but this tracking system helps you distill the emergency orders or legislation that your city, state, county, any level of government have actually put into effect around eviction and when they expire. And that includes information about utility shutoffs, and it's basically a scorecard so you can understand where you stack up and how long do protections last for people in your community. And that's kind of how you can start to predict your cliff. When people, due to joblessness, are going to be falling off a cliff. The Eviction Lab also has a tracking system that's a newer resource, but definitely check it out. They're going to be tracking the top evictors as well. So if you're engaging in local conversations and trying to talk to owners that might be going down that path, this is a good place to find data and or also provide data if you have it. And then also Just Shelter is a great resource to help identify local eviction prevention services and housing counseling, whatever's available locally. And then just generally, as you are thinking about housing needs and how you set priorities, DCTA actually, first resource on here, has a great set of resources and guidance. And the weekly household pulse survey that the Census Bureau is conducting will also help you understand, at the local level, what's happening with jobs, what's happening with tenants and perception of stability in terms of housing or jobs. Do people expect to be able to return to work? Are people concerned about being able to pay rent next month? And how those things break down across different demographics as well. So, we are seeing in the Pulse survey that 41% of Black and Latino households are concerned about paying rent next month. This is at a country, national level. 21% of white households said the same thing. So this is hitting home for a lot of people, obviously. So if you want to understand better locally what it looks like and what your community is facing, these are just the resources we would like to put out there for you. So we're going to move into a little more discussion about resources, talking about federal specifically and CARES Act. And so I'm actually going to pass the ball to Leslie, and she will continue our conversation.
Thank you, Callie. I am waiting for the ball. There it is. So I can move the slides, but I'm actually not going to move the slide because I'm going to say a couple of initial things. First of all, the Housing Assistance Council covers rural housing specifically, and we would like to think that we are a great resource if you need information about rural areas, small towns, all kinds of things not just related to coronavirus, but related to housing. And I want to mention a lot of the housing resources that we're going to talk about here come from the CARES Act, which Callie mentioned. You probably know what this is, but just in case, it stands for the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. It was passed by Congress and signed by the President. It became law on March 27th, so that's the starting point for some time periods that become important in understanding what's available. This was the third or fourth relief bill that became law, but it's the really huge one. It provided the $1,200 checks to everyone. It created all kinds of new stuff for business and lots of other things besides housing. It did create one new program that can be used for housing, which I'll talk about in a second. It provided funds for existing programs administered by FEMA and HUD. It did not provide any funds for USDA's existing programs. We hope that there will be some of those in the in future relief bills, assuming that there's at least one more. And the CARES Act also imposed a moratorium on evictions of many tenants and provisions for protecting homeowners, which I will talk about at the end of this resources section of the presentation. So the first thing I want to mention is FEMA. FEMA needs to be involved by a declaration coming from the government, from the President specifically. So in this case, there are two kinds of declarations that apply. One is the National Emergency Declaration that President Trump issued on March 13th. This is something that's provided for in law, but as you might remember hearing, this was the first time that this had ever been used. This sort of, you know, we've got something, and it's not just a hurricane on one coast, it's the entire country. There are also major disaster declarations for each state and territories in DC. Those are the kind of declarations that you're more familiar with, where the governor has requested something from the president that will activate FEMA's ability to help. And those went into effect sort of state by state, starting in March and extending. I think the latest ones were actually done in May. They enable FEMA to reimburse 75% of what are called Category B expenses for emergency protective measures taken by various levels of government, and sometimes for housing purposes also by nonprofits. And the Category B costs that are listed here on the slide are the kind of things that you get in most disasters like hurricanes and flooding and so forth, where FEMA will cover the cost of providing congregate shelter and evacuating people and providing generators when electricity's gone out and so forth. In this particular disaster, none of those are needed as much, but one of the things that Category B is covering is non-congregate shelter, which is, for example, hotel and motel costs for people who were homeless, people who were unsheltered. The other 25% of the expense, FEMA covers 75%, the other 25% can be covered by Coronavirus Relief Act funds, Coronavirus Relief funds, which I am going to talk about in a minute, if those funds are available. The CARES Act, as I mentioned, did not create any new programs for FEMA, but it did provide money for FEMA's existing programs. Look at the difference in the dollar amounts here. $45 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund, $200 million, slightly less, for the Emergency Food and Shelter Program. The Disaster Relief Fund is FEMA's main source of money that covers things, categories called public assistance and individual assistance. Public assistance is where the Category B items that we talked about on the last slide come from. individual assistance could be provided out of this disaster relief fund, but it is not being provided. It's not authorized under any of those major disaster declarations for the states and territories, because that's the kind of thing that helps individuals and households when their homes are damaged or destroyed by a physical disaster. And in this case, that kind of flooding, hurricane, et cetera, is not happening. The Disaster Relief Fund also covers some other smaller things, so that's what the and more is, that the public assistance and individual assistance are the major things. Emergency Food and Shelter Program, despite the similar name, is not related to HUD's Emergency Solutions Grant Program, which Anselmo is going to talk about in a few minutes. EFSP provides things like shelter, food, and supportive services. The way to find your local EFSP program, if you're not already familiar with it, is through the United Way, because it's the sort of, I don't know if this is not a term of art, it's sort of the administering organization, but I don't know if that's the correct terminology. The aid that's available under EFSP for any one family or household is very limited. It's like a one-time rent payment or one-time utility payment or 30 days of hotel costs. For a lot of people in a lot of situations, that's what they need. And so it's a really useful, as the name suggests, emergency program. This is more of an ongoing emergency. And the funds are divided among all the states and many of the counties. So there's a list on the United Way's EFSG website that shows a bunch of counties, not the majority, but certainly a bunch, particularly in rural places because it's based on population, are getting like less than $10,000 from this emergency. They're getting their annual money from the EFSP as well, but not a whole lot that can be done with that funding, but hopefully it is useful in some ways. The Coronavirus Relief Fund I mentioned that was created by the CARES Act it distributed billions and billions of dollars. I don't remember the total amount, but it's a minimum of $1.25 billion per state and smaller amounts for tribes and territories. Local governments with larger populations, 500,000 or more, 500,000 or more, could apply for direct allocations from the Treasury Department. That happened by the middle of April, so if a locality, a city or county or multiple cities or counties in your states are going to get money directly, then they already know that, and you probably already know that. And that reminds me that we were going to have a poll here, and I'm just sort of chatting on and forgetting, Sarah, if
yep. I'll go ahead and
put that up.
Sarah, I'm taking presenter privileges back now, but I'll go ahead and open that poll.
Okay. That was actually not the poll I was expecting.
Oh, sorry. Close this poll.
We can do that one.
No, sorry about that. Just give me 1 second.
There's one that's specifically about the Coronavirus Relief Fund.
Sorry. It's just having me wait a second while it waits for people to respond. So I'll go ahead and open the second one. Okay, here we go. Opening the correct poll now.
There we go. So the questions are, all states and territories received Coronavirus Relief Fund monies. Did your locality, city, county, township, etc., receive any directly? The answers are yes, no, or don't know. And then the second question is, has your locality or state identified how it will use all of its coronavirus relief fund monies? Because as the slide says, the funds can be used for a lot of different things. The possible answers there are yes, with some for housing or homelessness, B, yes, but none for housing or homelessness, C, they've not yet decided, and D, I don't know. So thanks in advance for your answers to those questions. I can keep talking. I'm not sure if I should keep talking while folks are answering the poll because I don't want to distract you.
How about we give people another like 15 seconds or so to respond in silence, and then I'll close it off.
Okay.
Time. Great, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. So hopefully everybody got their responses in. You should just a couple more seconds now that I've closed it to get your responses in. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and share the responses with all attendees, so I can still read through, but just so people have them to reference as well.
Yeah.
But I'll quickly run through the responses. It looks like in terms of the first question around the states and territories receiving coronavirus relief fund monies, did your locality receive any directly? We have 47% who said yes, and 6% who said no. 12% of people said they don't know. And then around, has your locality or state identified how it will use all of its coronavirus relief fund monies? We received 30% of people who said yes, 3% of people who said, 30% of people who said yes with some for housing and homelessness, and 3% of people who said yes, but none for housing and homelessness. 14% of people said not yet, and 18% of people didn't know.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is useful for me to see that there's also a bunch of no answers, because that explains why for the previous poll, when you were just reading off the answers, the percentages did not add up to anywhere close to 100%. Now I see why. So this is clearly a lot of you know that some of the coronavirus relief fund money for your area is going to be used for housing or something housing related. So that's very useful. The large proportion of people whose jurisdictions got it directly indicates to me that we have more people than I had expected from larger local governments, although I guess a bunch of people could be in counties that are large, even if your towns are not large. Going back to where I was, when I remembered that we were supposed to do the poll, any level of government that receives the money, so that's either the state or the county in most cases, can allocate it to sub-jurisdictions, but they're not required to. So some states and counties are passing it through, but they don't have to. They can still serve the population of the smaller town or city or whatever, but they would be doing that themselves rather than reimbursing the local government. The funding, as I said, can be used for a whole lot of different things. The restrictions are that whatever it's used for must be necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency. It has to be not already budgeted for. The assumption is that if something was already included in the local government's budget, then it was already supposed to be accounted for, and even if the local government's revenues have fallen, which is the case in an awful lot of places, that's not, the expenditures are not incurred due to the coronavirus. and the expenses covered by CRF must be incurred between March 1st and December 30th this year. December 30th is actually the date that's in the statute. I don't know why it's not December 31st, but be careful not to spend money on New Year's Eve. And if a state or county is passing money through to local governments, it has to be on a cost reimbursable basis. Some examples here, I'm not going to go through these in any detail in the interest of time, but I just have 3 random states, no idea how representative these are of other states, where in Washington State, there are some places that got money directly, and the state is allocating a chunk of the rest of its funds to places that did not get money directly, with an expectation that each place will get a certain amount based on its population, although you do have to apply for reimbursement. So if a place never applies for never does anything or never applies for reimbursement, then it's not going to get the money back. In Georgia, there were counties that got direct allocations, and in that state, cities that are in those particular 4 counties have to ask the counties for money, not the state. That's a difference. Georgia is also allowing for some of the funding to be provided as an advance, although you do have to document that that was used for eligible purposes. And in Louisiana, the whole amount went to the state, and so everybody, parishes, which you probably know are Louisiana's equivalent of counties, as well as towns and other local governments, can apply periodically for reimbursement directly from the state. And I'll be back later, but I'm going to turn this over to, I think, Mark.
Thanks, Leslie. All right, thanks. Well, my name is Mark Kudlowitz. I'm a Federal Policy Director here at LISC, and I'm going to be using my time to discuss the CDBG and home programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So some of you may be familiar with the Community Development Block Grant Program, or CDBG program. CDBG is an annual grant from HUD to formula block grant program that goes to states and localities to assist in the development of viable communities. And these communities are achieved by providing the following, principally for persons who are low and moderate income, which is decent housing, a suitable living environment, and expanded economic opportunities. And principally means the purpose of this program that, again, at a minimum, 70% of have to be expended by a state or what's termed an entitlement grantee, which is typically mid to larger size cities, should benefit low and moderate income people. So similar to the alphabet soup that Callie and Leslie we're going through, CDBG also has a lot of its own acronyms, similar to most federal programs. Importantly, especially for smaller communities, which I know is the purpose of this webinar, the way CDBG formula funding flows is that 70% go to these entitlement communities, and states and other areas receive the other 30%. And each state that receives CDBG typically passes it along to smaller towns and rural counties. These are called non-entitlement communities, which usually compete with one another for these funds. And every state has its own procedures within the CDBG regulatory framework for operating the program. And so you can see on the slide there's some general information. And the reason we're discussing that, the CDBG program, is that it's an important program, and it also received $5 billion in supplemental funding in the CARES Act. Okay. So for the next slide. So the CARES Act, which we discussed, provided a whole host of resources. And as we're going through this webinar, you can see that housing resources are in little places or in places within different programs. Housing there's not just one housing program in the federal government, like Callie was describing, with the different types of assisted housing that we have for affordable housing. And in the CARES Act, we didn't get just a very, very large amount of money for one housing program. We have programs at FEMA and Treasury with the Coronavirus Relief Fund and others that can be used for housing. And CDBG is somewhat similar since it can be used for a lot of different eligible uses. But what the CARES Act did provide was this $5 billion. And $2 billion of that went through the existing block grant formula, which was announced by HUD on April 2nd. So that's just using the existing way that HUD by statute and regulation puts out CDBG money to states to the entitlements and non-entitlements. The CARES Act, though, was unique in that it said the next tranche, this next $1 billion tranche, would go through a new formula that took into account COVID conditions and other public health factors, and that it would flow through the states, but it could be used for entitlement and non-entitlement communities. So again, usually we have this split where 70% is going to entitlement cities, 30% to states. This $1 billion tranche that was announced by HUD on May 11th could be used, went through the states, but could be used for the states for non-entitlements or to then go to entitlement. So it's a little confusing. And then Congress said there's another $2 billion tranche, which HUD can use a new formula as well, and which can be allocated on a rolling basis based on needs. So today, $3 billion of the $5 billion through CDBG has gone out. Now these CDBG activities, which they term CDBG-CV or CDBG coronavirus activities, must be used to prepare, prevent, and respond to the coronavirus public health crisis. The other interesting thing is that the CARES Act provided HUD really broad statutory and regulatory waiver authority for COVID-related purposes. So the department has the ability to use that authority from Congress to ease restrictions in law or regulation, which may make it difficult to use CDBG for coronavirus response efforts. And as you can see on the bullets on this slide, there's a lot of jargon here too that CDBG grantees, be it a state or a city, were given the ability to amend what's called their consolidated plan and their annual action plan and make changes and concurrently make changes to the citizen participation requirement, which informs amendments to the plans. They were given an expedited way to do that so that the documents could be updated quicker to reflect local need and to be able to get the money out quicker for response efforts. So like I was mentioning, CDBG can be used for a lot of different purposes, but that does include housing, importantly. And common uses of CDBG for housing purposes include housing rehabilitation, which can be rehabilitating both single-family properties and also rental housing. And that's one of the more common uses nationally is especially a lot of single-family rehabilitation work, emergency repairs, which could be even more important right now as we know that we need housing stability to keep low-income families safe during this crisis where they need the shelter in place. It can also be used for acquisition for rental housing, so for projects where we need to acquire land, and under limited circumstances, it can be used for new construction. Importantly, the CARES Act, we'll back up a little bit. It can also be used broadly for housing-related service activities. So this includes housing counseling and what are termed public service activities, which you see in the third bullet. Public service activities in the CDBG program are service activities that the program can fund. They typically have a 15% cap on the amount that a grantee can use for public services, but that cap was waived in the CARES Act, which allows more flexibilities. And we've seen many grantees using it for emergency rental assistance. So, you could use, which is generally capped at 3 months. So a grantee now could use any amount of that allocation for emergency rental assistance or other public service activities, which includes housing-related ones as well. Go to the also list some of the other flexibilities, some of which we've already discussed. Examples of this include, again, the expedited consolidated plan, which these, again, is how the money is used, and citizen participation waivers of those public service activity restrictions, and cost reimbursements for COVID-related activities. These flexibilities, importantly, include both CARES Act supplemental resources, so that $5 billion that HUD has been allocating, but importantly also include waivers for fiscal year 2019 and fiscal year 2020 allocations. So if you are interested in that, it's really important to consult the HUD waiver materials that are referenced to make sure which waivers are specific to which pot of money, since we have both waivers that are allowed for fiscal year 20, the previous year, fiscal year 19, and then also for the supplemental funding that are going through CARES. But the good news is hopefully that'll allow the dollars to go out quicker. The next program I'm going to talk about is the HUD Home Investment Partnership Program. HOME is the nation's only affordable housing block grant program. So it's similar to CDBG in that the money goes out by formula to states and to cities. But importantly, this program is only specifically for affordable housing, while the Community Development Block Grant Program can be used for affordable housing, but is often used for other purposes, like to support microenterprises, small businesses, and other needs. So HOME also has its own jargon. The term of art is participating jurisdictions. These are the term for the states and local governments that are eligible to receive HOME formula funding. And that formula takes into account relative housing need. In the HOME program, the funds are divided between the states, which receive 40%, unlike CDBG, where it's 30%, and units of general local government, which receive 60%. There was no supplemental funding provided for the HOME program in the CARES Act, but HUD did issue waivers for current and previous fiscal year HOME allocations. So again, as we talk through this, you really want to reference some of the links in the slide deck to make sure that you know the specific waivers for the specific pot of money, and those HUD waiver notices are available, hyperlinked and on their website. The intent of the HOME program is to increase the supply of decent affordable housing to low and very low income households, expand the capacity of nonprofit housing providers for our nonprofits that are on the phone today, strengthen the ability of state and local governments to provide affordable housing, and really leverage private sector participation. Generally, HOME funds can be used to support 4 eligible activities. Used for homeowner rehabilitation, so this is to existing owners with.
Hey Mark, sorry to interrupt, but your audio is cutting in and out a little bit right now. I'm not sure if that's happening for other folks, but if it's possible, if you could just like sit a little closer to your computer, and then if it keeps happening, I might ask if we can switch your audio.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Sarah?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. So it can be used, the 4 purposes is that HOME can be used for homeowner rehabilitation, which I just mentioned. It can be used for home buyer activities that participating jurisdictions, the states and localities can finance the acquisition, rehab, or new construction of home for home buyers. It's often used for affordable rental housing, and it can be used for that may be acquired or rehabilitated or for new construction, and it can be paired with the low-income housing tax credit program. And then importantly, it can be used for tenant-based rental assistance. So another source for emergency rental assistance, and this would be financial assistance for rent, security deposits, and sometimes utilities as well.
Hi Mark, we just
Yes.
lost you again for a little bit. If you is there anything that we can ask for you to switch your audio to dial in?
Yes. Sorry, Sarah.
And you can do that by going to if you have your phone. Sorry to make you do this in the middle. If you have your phone handy, you can go to audio and then switch your audio there.
One moment, sorry guys.
Yep, take your time. Bye everyone, thanks for sitting tight.
Hi, Sarah. Is this working better?
Yep, I can hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. I'll go relatively quickly because I don't want to take up too much time here. But this slide shows some of the statutory suspensions and regulatory waivers available to major disaster areas, which includes most places at this point with the coronavirus crisis. HUD has released the notice, which is hyperlinked, that waives the 10% administration and planning cap for the jurisdictions, for the participating jurisdictions for home awards. They are now suspended, and they enable states and localities to expend up to 25% of their fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 allocation in the program income, which is money that's recycled for administrative and planning costs. It also suspended what's called the CHODO, Community Housing Development Organization, I believe. This is a suspension of the amount of money that through the home program that has to go to CHODOs, which is 15%. And this suspension was enacted to make additional home funds available for activities such as tenant-based rental assistance, for which CHODO set-aside funds cannot be used. We also, the notices suspended the amount for CHODO operating expenses. So there's a certain standard. The regulations currently limit the amount of CHODO operating assistance for a state or locality to 5% of its each annual home allocation, and these were suspended and waived to permit a participating jurisdiction to provide up to 10% of its fiscal year 19 and 20 home allocations operating assistance. And this is really designed to help a lot of those nonprofit affordable housing organizations with any sort of operating shortfall as they see decreases in operating revenue and strains from fundraising and delays with construction projects. And the last one is the matching fund contribution, which is generally around 25%, is also suspended for fiscal year 20 and 21, as it's obviously more difficult for folks to raise match for federal work programs. And then quickly, we have a list of other regulatory waivers. I won't go through each of them. A lot of these were designed, they're available for all participating jurisdictions. Some of them were designed to make the program more easy to use for tenant-based rental assistance, since we need more sources of emergency rental assistance for folks at risk of eviction. Some of them are related to project completion deadlines that are hardwired into the statute or to the regulations on when projects are going to be completed, since we're experiencing delays with a lot of affordable housing projects and lease-up delays around the country. And then some are related to some of the administrative requirements for using some of the home funds. So that, I'll turn it over to the next person.
I think that's me.
Yes, we can hear you, Anselmo.
Sarah, oh, okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much. This is Anselmo Tejas, housing specialist with the Housing Assistance Council, and I'm gonna be talking about ESG, and I'm also going to be talking about the programs of USDA and rural development, and I will get into the specifics on the Emergency Solutions Grant, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the resources on HUD Exchange, because we're going to be a little bit pressed for time here, but we did want to give you some very important links. And I wanted to express to you that in the ESG program, funds need to go out to service providers, to continuums of care. So in this particular program, strategic partners cooperating with public health authorities, homeless organizations, is really critical to the program. And when you had time to go back to the presentation, this last link here on disaster response and rehousing we kind of gave you a little bit of the logo there. It has some really great links regarding emergency congregate housing, outreach, affordable housing, rapid rehousing, and so just wanted to say a little bit about that, and then I wanted to tell you a little bit about the program itself. So basically, ESG funds have 5 program components. There's street outreach, there's emergency shelter, there's homeless prevention, there's rapid rehousing assistance, and then the ability to use some of ESG funds for administrative costs. So in the street outreach, this provides for organizations to engage the homeless individual and families and provide essential services related to reaching out to those unsheltered homeless individuals, connecting them with emergency shelter, housing, and critical services, including urgent care. On the emergency shelter side, organizations are able to provide renovation or conversion of buildings to serve as emergency shelters, provide essential services, unemployment assistance and job training, and outpatient health services, mental health services, and substance abuse treatment, as well as transportation. Under the third component, homeless prevention, funds can go to housing relocation, stabilization services, short and medium-term rental assistance, and there's flexibility in the program, setting amount caps, setting total assistance caps, and setting duration of assistance. And then the fourth component would be the rapid rehousing assistance. And in this category, we could see housing relocation and stabilization services, again, including rental assistance as well, to help families living in shelters or places that aren't habitable move into permanent housing, and also moving individuals from congregate living environments to more suitable and safe housing. And whereas we saw some funds that we talked about, the purpose was to provide for congregate living, in this particular case and in the current situation, some congregate living environments are not the best environments, and so taking folks out of that temporarily into a safer environment, we'll be able to use funds. And then finally, ESG funds up to 7.5% of recipients' allocation can be used for administrative activities. Now, eligible recipients, again, it's a formula grant program similar to home and CDBG, and eligible recipients are usually metropolitan cities, urban counties, territories, and states. And in this program, states must subgrant all of the ESG funds. So there's why early on I said this is a program that requires and necessitates cooperation between state and public and local organizations. And
Selma, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it looks like we might be running a little bit tight on time. So if it's okay, we might just let folks know that these resources and the relevant links will all be made available in the slides after the webinar is over so they can follow up. But if it's okay, I might ask you to move to the housing strategy piece and just skip the next couple of overview pieces.
Sure. Matter of fact, I just had one more point to make. And so it's time. Yeah, and then all recipients must consult with continuum of care organizations. So yeah, so I will speed this up, and I want to talk about the USDA programs quickly, and And USDA is a rural organization, rural development, and so we're talking about communities of 20,000, 35,000, 50,000, depending on the program that we're talking about. And so so an effective COVID response was going to require some short-term and some long-term strategies, and matching those strategies to available resources to address both. So as we look at USDA, as Leslie mentioned, the CARES Act didn't really address new programs or additional dollars for USDA. So what we're going to be talking about is what USDA was doing internally, the measures they took to kind of react to the COVID environment. So I just want to say that USDA not only has housing programs, they have over 40 programs serving rural communities. Single family, multifamily are just two of them. We have community facilities, telecommunications programs, rural electric programs, water and wastewater programs, business and cooperative programs, and there are special initiatives for providing technical assistance and capacity building. In the housing programs, I'm just going to summarize it in there are direct loans that are authorized and funded directly from the agency for single family and for multifamily development. There are loans to provide home repairs. There are grants for seniors, 62 of age or older. There is opportunities for multifamily developments through guaranteed programs, including rental assistance and the financing of farm labor housing and families projects throughout the country. And we know how much we really know how critical our agricultural workers are to the economy. And so I just want to talk about one more, and that's community facilities. It's indirectly related, but it's important because this is where we have the ability to do infrastructures, to build senior care centers, hospitals, clinics. We can do telemedicine, libraries, schools, community centers. And so now that seems to really be an important aspect of what we need in terms of rural infrastructure. So USDA, I think I have another slide. What's it doing in terms of single family? Of course, foreclosure moratorium. Borrowers also who are experiencing a reduction of income can request payment assistance. If they already are receiving it, they can ask for more. Moratoriums of up to 180 days with an option to extend for another 180 days are available, after which the loans will be modified, reconstructed, refinanced for the remaining part of the loan, and for the new applicants that were in the pipeline, their certificates of eligibility can be extended. On the multifamily side, the Section 514 farm labor housing loan, those properties may now use their operating accounts and their reserve accounts to cover shortfalls. And for properties for loan guarantees, lenders, they control the reserves and they are able to use those reserves. And so I'm just going to just skip this one. I just want to talk about loan guarantees. So now USDA has authorized lenders to authorize deferrals, and that is without any future or necessarily having to contact USDA. And then let me just close it up by saying that about strategic partnerships, bringing together networks, the expertise of organizations, their capacity, their collective resources. There are organizations out there like LISC, like HAC, that can provide technical assistance to local communities in a lot of these programs, and as well as pre-development loan assistance. So I'm gonna turn it over to
Thanks, Anselmo.
You bet.
Appreciate it very much. We just wanted to alert you guys to the next two slides. You'll have them in your deck, eviction protections and also forbearance and foreclosure protections. So this is all here for your reference. We will not go through them on this call. We're going to actually move straight into crafting your housing strategy. And I'm going to pass the ball to Lillian Alexander on our team. And we are moving the PowerPoint forward. Lillian, you are up.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure I see the, there it goes. There it goes. So glad that everyone can make time to be here today. You heard some great information about the federal resources that are available to address housing needs in your communities. This pandemic has really impacted people in a big way, and so the funding that has been allocated can't meet the need, and I think lots of folks have already talked about that. And when you are a small city or town and you have to go through the state, then the county potentially to get funds, you put little money left and available to you on the federal level for your housing response. So it's so critical to be strategic in the placement of the funding so that the dollars you have can have the greatest impact. And that's why we wanted to talk about a housing strategy for those communities that may not have a lot of money. What can the response be? And we think it really will benefit folks to take time and try to build a strategy based on long-term goals, actually. So in this section, I just want to highlight three things that we hope you will take away with you, and then I'll try to quickly go through the different steps that we have. So the first point is that the housing strategy will help achieve an impactful response with the dollars you have. It will help you focus the dollars. The second thing is we encourage you to think long-term, to think about the long-term housing needs. As Callie said in the beginning, the pandemic has exacerbated issues that already existed. So in your response, think of ways that the emergency response can help in the long run. The third point is trying to understand that different ways of measuring the success of your housing strategy. It's important to respond to as many people and to the needs, to the greatest need. However, like we've said before, the dollars may not be available to respond to all your needs. So try to think of other metrics as well. This is a time where you can educate people on the housing needs in your community. Perhaps there was not the buy-in that is necessary to really respond to the affordable housing needs. This is a good opportunity to develop collaboration with organizations that, and even outsider organizations that were not part of the affordable housing industry before. So why build a strategy? Very quickly, focus dollars, get a plan together so you can secure financial support from the private sector. It'll be ways that you can point out that, to try to convince businesses and funders that their dollars will have an impact, and also that there will be positive impact on the private sector. And also, a housing strategy can help the community because they really, I think people really want to see their government working for them. And with a plan, it will help to people to see that there's been deliberate action in response to such a huge need. Again, because there are some folks that will not be able to return to their condition prior to the pandemic, at least people will see that our government officials are really working hard to help the situation. Did I already, let me go back here. I think I may have missed. I'm just going to move forward to the elements of the housing strategy, focusing on long-term goals, like I said earlier. And very important is the gathering of information stage. On slide 7, I believe it was Kelly made reference to the eviction lab. Very important to gather information, prioritize your needs, poll the community. What are the needs of the community? Again, to get buy-in, talking with organizations perhaps that you've never talked with before, and coming up with community priorities. Determining the availability of funds is an important step as well. You have local funding. Is there a way to redirect some of the funding that you have to COVID assistance? That's a very important step in the process. And looking at what state funds and programs are available. So for instance, are you maximizing the use of weatherization money, say on the state level for home repair? Are there other types of state programs that can be sort of packaged as part of your housing policy? Private dollars, making sure that you reach out to the private sector. The private sector would include anchor institutions such as hospitals, colleges, foundations, the big employers in an area, reaching out to as many different entities as possible to see if they may be willing to contribute to a larger community-wide effort to respond to the crisis. I want to go back here really quickly just to make sure. Directing funding. Okay, one of the things I wanted to mention that I passed over here is the tools that were developed in this emergency stage. It's really important to just focus on, again, how to make the most of the situation. And this webinar is one good way in terms of really understanding the flow of federal funds and how funds can flow to your local communities, focusing in how to leverage private dollars to help government objectives. IT is a big thing here too. It's like, how can you, say, improve your systems, technological systems, delivery systems, to help minimize the cost of your program, and then also to just be more effective in the outcome. And finally, part of redirecting the funding includes redirecting staff, because I know a lot of you are working with limited staff in addition to limited funding. So you're going to have to find creative ways to actually staff the program that you're going to develop. So I'm quickly going back over here. Once you have And I'm sorry about this, everybody. I think I passed over gathering information. I got a little time here. So in terms of information, we wanted to highlight some questions that we think are important for you to ask as part of the development of your strategy. Wanting to make sure that you have a good sense of who really is in need. So these are some questions that you can ask. Who's requesting food from the food bank? What is the eviction rate? Have courts started hearing eviction? And who is behind on utility payments? We haven't talked as much about multifamily property owners, but again, in the subsequent phases of recovery, we're going to have to make sure that property owners have capitalized reserves, that they're paying a mortgage, because if not, then we lose affordable housing units. So it's important to keep them in mind as well. What assistance is already being provided by the private sector? This is very important too when you're trying to stretch your dollars, trying not to duplicate efforts, trying to join efforts. The effort can be regional. It can be, city, 2 or 3 cities together. It's like whatever you need to do to try to get access to funding. So it can be a regional foundation. It can be, like I said already, anchoring institutions. Find out if different entities are providing discounts on things or providing food, and considering all of this in your strategy.
Lillian.
Yes.
Hey, we're going to move into Q&A in just a minute. We've got some folks teeing up. We know you've got a couple of examples. Can we spend about a minute on each and then move straight to Q&A for the last 10 minutes?
Sure.
That'd be great.
One of the examples here is Ulster County. It's a larger county than some of your areas, but it's important. This is an example that shows a holistic view of the situation. A task force was created. The task force consisted of people in different sectors: mental health, education, housing. Everyone got together to figure out the needs of the community. The rental assistance program that they came up with was a reallocation of CDBG funds from a home repair to rental assistance. So they took what they had, purposed it for the current crisis, using the same subrecipient that was doing the home repair to actually administer the rental assistance program. Looking long-term, while there's time to get buy-in from other folks, focusing on promoting a citywide, trying to make a county land bank instead of a city land bank. So trying to expand the reach of the land bank to promote workforce housing. This community decided that workforce housing is what they needed, so that's part of their strategy with the land bank. Housing studies, the same. Focus is workforce housing, but as part of this package in responding to COVID, they are using a housing study to sort of redirect the conversation about where funding should go for affordable housing. This next response, this next example is the California Coalition for Rural Housing. And this is an example of a community that came together, and no government funding was part of this example. But yet government officials are part of the collaboration. So they're health foundations, banks, donors, but also they're government officials. Raised $330,000 and did a survey to sort of determine what the needs were, and then put money out and tried to be as flexible as possible to respond to the local needs. So government officials are, another way of doing the work is trying to bring private sector collaborations together to respond to your community's needs. Okay, so I will pass it back, I guess, to you, Callie.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, Leanne. Great examples. We want to hear more from you all. We realize some of you are upstream in all this too, trying to just sort out, what the many needs are in your communities. So, to that end, we have a lot of resources embedded in this deck. So I want to point you to a couple of those as you put your Q&As in the panel on the right. So please send us your Q&As and we will try to address them. But you'll see here on slide 41, we've got that summary of unassisted households and risk, followed by assisted households, less risk on the assisted households type. And then back in the deck early on in slide 4 or 5, we have those resources that'll point you to the pulse survey so you can understand, what's actually happening on a weekly basis in your community, and that's the U.S. Census Bureau survey. And we also have if you can see this one, a summary here of the housing resources that everyone today went over. So starting with FEMA and the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and this is really showing you kind of, what's the basic eligibility, how do you access the funds, use the funds, and can it be thought of as a long-term or short-term rental solution, short-term housing solution? So you've got, those immediate rental assistance needs that are coming at you based on people unable to pay rent. And then you also have those longer-term needs around how do we build more housing? How do we get more supply and production of affordable housing? How do we support projects that are already in the pipeline of some of our smaller groups and developers? And how do we maintain the solvency and the health of existing properties? Senior and elderly properties are particularly hard hit right now because they're experiencing skyrocketing operating costs, just having to deliver meals door to door. It's expenses that were not accounted for in a budget, and a lot of these properties run on very tight budgets to begin with due to the missions that they serve. So just thinking about how you balance those short-term and long-term needs, and hopefully these housing resources will help you think through that, and we will make sure that this is all up to date with anything new. I believe that I'm not sure if we have any questions. Sarah, do we have any questions coming in?
Yep, this is Sarah. We do actually have several questions. I'll do my best to try to feed those to you as quickly as possible, but I think as well, if it's okay, we can also do some work on our end after the webinar is over, following up on some of those questions and making the answers available with the other materials that we circulate to people.
Yes, absolutely. So this is great. We'll have a couple of questions now. You guys should, there's a follow-up webinar that's going to be scheduled very shortly. So this is supposed to be the big overview today, and we're going to, at least mention your questions, try to touch on a couple of them, and then the feedback that we get will also inform the next webinar, and we'll also put it out in writing if that's helpful.
Exactly. So with that, I'll just dive right into questions so we have ample time. Our first one is from Don Bacon. So all panelists, if we are clearly in an affordable housing crisis that has worsened due to COVID, could most dollars that go to affordable housing efforts be interpreted as necessary expenditures incurred due to the COVID public health emergency, provided that they were not budgeted previously?
This is Leslie Strauss from HAC. I think that's a reference to the CARES Act limitation that I don't think you don't have to worry about that for housing funding that's coming from other sources. Just to make that clear, that would only be for the Coronavirus Relief Fund, if I'm understanding the question correctly. And there are examples. The Treasury Department's website has examples of how to determine what kinds of things are necessary in response to the coronavirus emergency. A lot of housing expenses will fall into that category, I think.
Yeah.
Rental assistance for people that didn't have it before, for example.
Yeah, we'll give you a couple of examples here, and we can follow up more. I think Leslie's got some detail on this. For CARES Act, Coronavirus Relief Fund, for example, you can use that for immediate rental assistance needs, mortgage payment assistance if it's COVID related, job loss or something similar, business loss, loss of income, housing counseling as well. So you can actually use it for homeowner counseling if people are moving toward foreclosure. You can also use it to purchase or acquire sites or land for new affordable housing purposes, as a source for new construction of affordable housing. So you can, buy land or sites to create new housing, and also you can use it as a rehab or renovation resource. So if you need to create even like testing sites, there's ability to do that, with coronavirus relief fund. It's a very flexible fund. The thing that it can't be used for is that longer term rental assistance need. So the money kind of has to go into the project, and it's term limited. So you can't count on it for operating assistance for, the next few years. But we can also follow up with more specifics on that.
Thanks, Callie and Leslie. And we have a couple more questions about some of the possible use cases for some of the funding that was expanded through the CARES Act. So I'll ask those, but I would also just note, if there's any follow-up needed, we'll share all of these questions with the presenters to expand on and circulate with the materials. So we also have a question from Charlene Thompson on community land trust. So can ESG-CV funding be used to build new affordable housing that promotes home ownership under the CLT model?
I think I actually will maybe ask Leslie, do you want to respond, or Mark?
This is Leslie. I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so, the uses on ESG, we'll follow up specifically on CLT, but think of ESG more on the kind of immediate rental assistance needs,
yes,
and homeowner counseling. You can use it for new construction, and you can use it for rehab. What you can't do, and a lot of CLT models require and need, that longer term money in the mix. You can't. It's term limited to 24 months during any 3-year period. That's the limit on ESG.
Great, thank you. And then will there be additional guidance released on distribution of the CDBG-CV funding specific to public service categories? Misty Goodwin is hoping for additional guidance related to rental assistance under CDBG and is curious if income documentation will remain the same or if any flexibility will be given with regard to projected income requirements.
Okay, those are great questions. I don't have the answer. Perhaps Mark does.
Yeah, hi, this is Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep,
we can hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay, great. Yes, so the public service cap, the 15% waiver, the HUD put out a notice months ago. I think it was actually hyperlinked to one of the CDBG slides that I was referencing that actually states some basics on the 15% cap. HUD is anticipating putting out a broader Federal Register notice, providing additional waivers for the CDBG program. So there could be additional detail in that forthcoming Federal Register notice. But the 15% cap, because it was in the statutory language in the CARES Act, is self-implementing. So to your point on the administrative requirements on the documentation for entitlements and grantees, that I'm not completely sure. I can follow up and look at that. It may also be something, though, that's in the forthcoming guidance, but we can follow up on that one.
Thank you, Mark. And we have a question from Beverly Carlton. Does HUD generate local demographics for that community, for the community's consolidated plan? Which period or years would be used for the current consolidated plan?
Hi, this is Mark again. HUD does have data to help inform the consolidated planning process. I don't know off the top of my head if you're referring to the current fiscal year, for fiscal year 20, the federal fiscal year we're in now, what the specific time periods are. That is also something I can follow up on, though, individually.
Thank you, Mark. We will follow up on that. We've logged several other questions. So today was supposed to be the big overview. We are excited for the second round, which we will go deeper. And some of you asked questions we did not quite get to today. So please note that we're putting those in our parking lot. And in particular, I see your question, Andrew, and also Teresa. We will get you answers, and we will follow up. So look for the deck and and materials from today. And I believe Sarah will close us out.
Yep, thanks so much, Callie. I just wanted to echo what Callie noted about this being the first of 2 housing sessions. I also wanted to take a second to just say a big thanks to all of our panelists today. And then one reminder that the recording and materials will all be available. In addition to the other housing session that will be coming down the pipeline, we also wanted to mention that this is the first session of a 6-part webinar series. So we'll be doing 2 webinars around the topics of health, economic development, and housing. The next session on July 20th will be around health. The following session will be on the topic of economic development, and following that will be housing, and then the pattern will be repeated. So be on the lookout for those registration openings, and you can register the same way that you did for this webinar, which is through the HUD Exchange website. So we look forward to seeing you all again for future sessions, and thanks again to all of our great panelists.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.